At approximately midnight, between June 16th to August 1483, sources vary, 2 young boys, Edward V, the 12-year-old king-in-waiting, and his younger brother, 9-year-old Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York, and as his titles were even longer than this, I will just refer to him as Richard, Duke of York from this point on, or just Richard, or pretty much whatever I decide to do. I'm the narrator. Anyway, the boys vanished without a trace from the Tower of London, leaving a haunting mystery that would echo throughout time. The disappearance of the boys remained one of the most debated and tragic episodes of England's tumultuous history during the Wars of the Roses and beyond. This perspective on an historical mystery, while certainly nothing groundbreaking and nipping at the heels of many, many other perspectives or bona fide documentaries, if you will, merely gives a small glimpse and poses unanswered questions into the complex and treacherous events leading up to the boys' disappearance, the political intrigue surrounding their fate, and the countless theories that have arisen about what really happened to transform a duke into King Richard III and his seizing of the throne. Many refer to the story as The Princes in the Tower, but that's a misnomer, as Edward V was now technically King Edward V, and Richard was Duke of York, plus a few other titles. I've had a long interest in doing a reading of this story. It's an age-old whodunit and always seems to be tantalizingly close, but so far away from being solved. Yet while doing so, we must remember, again, that these were merely boys, 12 and 9-year-old children, and unfortunate pawns in an ongoing familial power struggle and race to rule a kingdom. Our story begins in the turbulent years of the late 15th century, a time marked by intense political and familial bloodline hostilities. The Wars of the Roses, a dynastic series of conflicts between the House of Lancaster, the Red Rose, led by Henry VI, and the House of York, the White Rose, led by Edward IV, had ravaged England for over 30 years, from approximately 1455 to 1485, but I've seen some accounts that say 1487. The House of York had emerged victorious in 1461, with the imprisonment of Henry VI and ascension of Edward IV to the throne. While hostilities were not at a complete end, Edward IV's reign seemed to be relatively stable after he defeated the Lancastrians, but by 1470, his throne was briefly usurped when supporters of Henry VI freed him from the Tower of London, and he was recrowned. Edward IV then escaped with his brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the future King Richard III, to the Netherlands and then on to Flanders, while Queen Elizabeth Woodville, Edward IV's wife, and their children, and while pregnant with Edward V, sought refuge in Westminster Abbey. However, their exile was short-lived as Edward IV returned in early 1471 to defeat Henry and regain his crown. Henry VI had been reincarcerated in the Tower of London, but did not last long, dying shortly thereafterwards. There are those that believe he died from anything depression-related to being outright murdered, Richard, Duke of Gloucester often implicated as the one having done the deed. Henry would have been seen as a threat, a thorn in the side, if you will, and a continuing problem, so the latter makes more sense to me and would not be surprising. But that's my opinion. Edward IV ruled on, fathering a total of 10 children with Elizabeth, and may have become a royal storybook ending. However, very rarely is there such an ending. Life just doesn't work that way. 1483 would set off a chain of events that would ultimately lead to the disappearance of those poor boys. It is said that on April 9th, 1483, Edward IV died suddenly, though some think there was an indication of his declining health from an unknown disease process, not necessarily as sudden as some might speculate, leaving the throne to his 12-year-old son Edward V. As was customary, Edward V's reign was to be overseen by a regency or protector until he came of age, and knowing that his time was near, King Edward IV declared his brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as Lord Protector. Edward V's mother, Elizabeth Woodville, sought to retain influence for her family, but the kingdom's politics were far from stable, and Edward IV's death plunged the court into a deadly struggle between factions. Having heard of his father's death, Edward V, his uncle Anthony Woodville, 2nd Earl Rivers, brother of Elizabeth Woodville, and his half-brother, Lord Richard Grey, son of Elizabeth from her previous marriage, in an armed escort made their way from Ludlow Castle toward London in order to have Edward V crowned and thereby secure their reign and power. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, had been in the north at the time of Edward IV's death, and word, allegedly, was intentionally delayed in being sent to him. However, now knowing that he was named as Lord Protector by Edward IV, Richard saw his opportunity and hastily made his way south to intercept his nephew and entourage. Richard III was a shrewd and ambitious man, dangerous. There are some who apparently believe that Richard was a good man, benevolent and philanthropic to the poor, but then so was Al Capone. It has been said that he was simply thrust into a situation where his responses were only reactionary, to be a protector and loyal to his brother's wishes. But I believe he may have had indications of Edward's declining health, or, not being out of the realm of possibility as proposed by some, by poisonous means, have been planning his steps to take the crown, one way or another. On April 29, 1483, Richard caught up to Edward V's escort at Stony Stratford in Buckinghamshire, ate, drank, and played that all was well. The following morning, April 30th, 1483, Richard placed Anthony Woodville, 2nd Earl Rivers, Lord Richard Grey, and others under arrest for trumped-up charges of treason, and had them transported north to Pontefract Castle, where they and others were later executed. Edward V protested this activity against his family, but Richard made excuses and accusations as normal to legitimize his actions. Plainly put, Richard didn't care what a 12-year-old thought, and would let nothing get in his way. With this, Richard took Edward V to London and locked him in the royal apartments of the White Tower. At first, he acted as the protector of his nephew, but tensions very quickly reached a boiling point in the royal court. The Woodville family were close allies of Queen Elizabeth, of course, and had been given great swaths of titles and lands, and had a very vested interest in the power of the crown, and had many enemies. The conflict between Richard's supporters and the Woodvilles deepened as both factions sought to control the young king. Initially, Edward V had been told that he was being kept at the tower for his safety, and in preparation for his coronation, which was standard practice. But excuse after excuse put the date off. However, Uncle Richard had other plans and took crucial steps for seizing the throne for himself. In my opinion, Richard's movements, removing obstacles or his perceived threats, were conducted too quickly to be a spur-of-the-moment thing or a mere split-second response. Too many were imprisoned, executed without trial, or forced to flee without this having been planned out, prepared ahead of time. But again, that's my opinion. After learning of the arrest of her son, brother and others, and Uncle Richard now having control of Edward V, Elizabeth Woodville had gathered her children and run to sanctuary in Westminster Abbey once again. Though she had been promised safety for herself and for her children, more importantly, Richard, Duke of York, she knew this could not last. On June 16, 1483, Richard's men entered Westminster Abbey in violation of the law of sanctuary and forced Elizabeth to hand over her son Richard, Duke of York. The reality being Elizabeth had no choice, and eventually her other children would be removed from her. 9-year-old Richard, Duke of York, was then taken from his mother. It was said that a slow, lingering glance over his shoulder was the last time Elizabeth saw his face. Having been taken to the Tower of London and secured with his brother Edward V, their fates were sealed. It had been announced that June 22, 1483 was finally set to be the coronation of Edward V, and so tasks were underway for the event. But this date was moved yet again. The dominoes had started falling early in June, and using a controversial claim that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid, benevolent Uncle Richard had a convention and Lord Buckingham declare that his nephews were illegitimate, and thus he, Richard, was the rightful king. The accusations, arrests, and summary executions that had been conducted since early June make it appear that Richard III's intent to seize the throne had become evident to most, and, well, many were afraid that they were next on the chopping block. It was simply an avalanche of terror that could not be stopped, in my opinion. On June 26, 1483, an act of Parliament legitimized Richard's claim of illegitimacy of the boys and his right as heir to the throne, and so, on July 6th, he was crowned King Richard III, having feigned resistance to accepting the crown and begrudgingly did, of course. The young Edward V and his brother Richard, Duke of York, were now prisoners in the Tower of London. No longer royals under protection in reality, but King Richard III kept up the facade. There are many differing accounts of the boys having been seen playing on Tower Green or in the windows of the tower, but their little forms became less and less noted, and neither had been seen outside the walls of the tower since Richard, Duke of York, had been taken there on June 16th. So, here we have it, a beginning timeline, if you will, but no one knows the actual date of their final disposition. The last recorded mention of them was supposedly in early August, when it was noted that they were still alive and well, but this is also up for speculation. Most think that any visuals were before or shortly after Richard III's coronation on July 6th. It appears that most of the writings or supposed eyewitness accounts pertaining to the boys were done many, many years after the fact or from third-person accounts, hearsay by today's standards. So details become clouded or just plain made up for differing reasons and narratives. Historians have debated what happened to the boys ever since. Several theories have emerged over the centuries, ranging from murder to escape. But one thing is clear. Edward and Richard were never witnessed to emerge from the Tower of London alive. The most widely accepted theory is that the boys were murdered, likely on the orders of Richard III. After all, Richard had much to gain by eliminating the legitimate heirs to the throne. The murder would have been carried out secretly within the tower to avoid any public outrage, and yet it appears that rumors very quickly began to spread of Richard III having killed his nephews. It also appears that Richard did nothing to quash these rumors. Had the boys been alive, he could have just simply produced them. Then if they had died, there could have been a story made up, an inquest done, or an autopsy report made and shown, but there was nothing. No denial. No affirmation. Just silence. Some historians have proposed the possibility that the boys were not killed, but instead were helped to escape. Some suggest that through a trail of papal statements and other records, they were smuggled out of the tower and lived in exile in Italy or other places, under the support of sympathizers to the Yorkist cause or family that had motivation in regaining the throne. There were multiple claimants to being either one of the boys, but few that were presented as legitimate possibilities. One, who claimed to be Richard, Duke of York, known as Perkin Warbeck, was supported by foreign courts as well as Margaret of York, Duchess of Burgundy, sister of Edward IV. However, after having been taken prisoner following multiple failed coups, he was initially entertained by Henry VII, but was eventually executed in 1499 for being more of an annoyance than he was worth. He had already escaped the tower once. Then there was Lambert Simnel, who attempted the same ploy. Being supported yet again by Margaret, was taken to Ireland, where he was even crowned as King Edward V. Having been taken prisoner after his failed usurpation at the Battle of Stokes in June of 1487, many believing this to be the last official battle in the War of the Roses, Henry VII realized that Simnel was just a young patsy created by the Yorkists. Henry VII allowed Simnel to live, made him a servant in the royal kitchen, became elevated to a falconer, and then died peacefully, I presume, in 1534. Could either one of these claimants have been Edward V or Richard, Duke of York? I highly doubt it, but that's my opinion, as neither scenario makes sense to me. When Henry Tudor defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, he became Henry VII, ushering the Tudor dynasty. To secure his position, Henry VII sought to eliminate any remaining claimants or general threats to the throne. Some believing that the disappearance of the boys was not Richard III's doing, but involved those in power under Henry VII, including Lady Margaret Beaufort, Henry VII's mother. Edward V and Richard, Duke of York's deaths might have been covered up as a means to protect the new monarch's rule and prevent any challenge to his reign. However, as I previously stated, Henry VII only executed Warbeck after he became too troublesome, and he allowed Simnel to live out his life in service. There were credible fears to Henry's throne by these individuals and their many supporters, both foreign and domestic, but he did not swiftly sow revenge upon them. And besides, were the boys even alive when Henry came to power after the Battle of Bosworth? I highly doubt it. And even their mother, Elizabeth Woodville, believed the boys were dead, more than likely before Richard was even crowned king July 6, 1483. The one name that continuously seems to crop up in connection to the murder is that of Sir James Tyrrell, who was under the employ of Richard III. In an excerpt from his book, History of King Richard III, Sir Thomas More noted that Tyrrell had two men under his command, Miles Forrest and John Dighton, kill the boys, and then bury them under a staircase. More then goes on to claim that Tyrrell confessed to this deed while under interrogation for treason, and shortly before his execution in 1502. Sir Thomas More's writings have been disputed, as he was only a small child at the time of the disappearances, may have been influenced by other previous writers or statements. and there are no other accounts of Tyrrell making such an admittance prior to his execution. However, I came across a Monday, December the 2nd, 2024 news article from the British National Archives entitled "Extraordinary New Clue About the Princes in the Tower Found at the National Archives," and it may give higher validity to Moore's writings. While conducting research and going through documents, Professor Tim Thornton, Deputy Vice-Chancellor of the University of Huddersfield at the time of the article, found an interesting entry. In a 1516 will of Lady Margaret Capel, half-sister of James Tyrrell's wife, Anne Tyrrell, Lady Capel bequeaths to her son, Sir Giles, his father's chain, or necklace, that was owned by King Edward V, as she stated. Apparently, this chain or necklace was well known to be Edward V's favored possession, and he always wore it. If Tyrrell had no part in the murder of the boys, then how did he come by it to pass it down through his family? Why would he claim to have such a personal, well-known item of young Edward V, implicating himself in a horrible deed, if he had no involvement? Henry VII was known to have destroyed many records and documents from Richard III's reign, so who knows what information was lost to corroborate this or other possibilities. Since before the coronation of Richard III and on, there have been many theories on what became of the boys, from being placed in a lead box and thrown in the Thames to being buried, found, walled up, found, and again buried under stairs. During reconstruction of the White Tower and its grounds, notably starting approximately 1600 or close thereto, there have been several remains found, human and animal. For those who may not know, the Tower of London had also been conducted as a zoo from the 13th century to the 19th century, and finally, closing in 1835, having sold animals off to other zoos, circuses, or moved into what became known as the London Zoo. In other words, there had been a lot of bones around the grounds for quite a while. In July 1674, workmen repairing the tower stairs uncovered a wooden chest containing the bones described as 2 children, which were thought to be the right age for the boys buried under approximately 10 feet of rubble, in the same manner as had been described by several writers all those years before. There's debate amongst many as to the actual location of the stairs. Some thought the remains were discovered under stairs on the inside, and others think them discovered outside under the stairs leading into the Chapel of St. John. By 1675, King Charles II had declared the found remains to be those of Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, and in February of that year, he had commissioned a special urn to be made by famous architect and artist Christopher Wren, and the bones placed therein. In 1678, the remains were interred in the Henry VII Chapel, Westminster Abbey, at the feet of Elizabeth I. In 1933, King George V gave royal permission for the alleged boys' remains to be examined. The urn was initially opened sometime during the evening of July 5th, and then covered with a cloth until the next morning. At approximately 0900, July 6th, 1933, Professor William Wright, Dr. George Northcroft, and Lawrence E. Tanner uncovered the urn and began their examinations. All present stated that there were 2 sets of skeletal remains of the right ages of the boys, but other statements or forensic investigative work of the time just doesn't meet today's standards. So in my opinion, though interesting, the findings are inconclusive or plain supposition. Even with the forensic techniques and capabilities of today, there would be no guarantee of obtaining quality mitochondrial DNA. General degradation, mixing of other bones, introduced DNA, poor handling and who knows what other contaminants are a real concern for testing. Osteological investigations and capabilities have greatly improved since 1933, but unless access is granted by the monarchy, it means nothing. Queen Elizabeth II was set against investigating the remains, fearing a hazardous precedent being set for just digging up monarchs and other reasons. King Charles III initially expressed some interest in further investigation, but nothing has come to pass as of this video posting. Though the fate of Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, remains unresolved, their story continues to captivate the imagination of historians and the public alike. Their disappearance is one of the most enduring mysteries in English history, symbolizing the instability and intrigue of the time. But questions and discovery of several child-aged remains have led many to believe that Edward and Richard had indeed been murdered under King Richard III's orders. The boys have become an emblem of royal tragedy. For centuries, their story has been told in literature, art, and drama. William Shakespeare famously depicted Richard III as a villainous monarch, misshapen by evil and responsible for the boy's death, a portrayal that has shaped popular opinion for generations. While having been thought of as a pure Tudor propaganda, the discovery of Richard III's remains in 2012 showed that he had severe scoliosis and deformity, but was known as a very experienced and capable warrior. King Richard III, like him or not, went down fighting at the Battle of Bosworth Field, having refused to leave. Were his descriptions mere literary and artistic license or propagandist besmirching? Probably. In the end, the story of Richard V and Richard, Duke of York, serves as a reminder of the fragility of a crown, the ruthlessness of familial politics, and the enduring allure of an unresolved missing persons case and crime in reality. I disagree with the outlook of some that this sets a bad precedent or just serves to allay some macabre interest. As I stated, this is a crime, and like any other unsolved missing person or homicide case, the victims deserve their recognition and history, its rightful ending. But that's my opinion. As we look back on the lives of these two boys, we are left with unanswered questions. Did Richard III murder his nephews to seize the throne? If not, who are the true perpetrators of their fate? Are the remains in the urn really the boys? And why have their stories remained so elusive for more than 500 years? The evidence is inconclusive either way. As stated, it would take royal intervention to allow the remains to be put under modern forensic scrutiny. But will that happen? What could be the historical implication or modern-day fallout? I don't know. Putting aside their titles and seeing them for the innocent children and pawns that they were, 12-year-old Edward and 9-year-old Richard may have vanished, but they and their story remain far from forgotten. On a personal note, I said in the beginning that this was just an historical missing persons mystery that I've been interested in for a very long time, like other mysteries I come across, and wanted to tell, if nothing else, in my own way. However, I've barely scratched the surface, and I'm no expert in history. So if this story, or the Middle Ages in general, interests you, I would advise you to follow the links in the description below to History Calling. I don't think I just want to say her name, not sure how she'd feel about that. There was no collaboration on this story, because, well, she has no clue who I am. Doesn't know me from Adam. I happened across her channel while doing some research on this story, but she gives a much better in-depth explanation into the events of Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York. I think you should check out all of her other presentations as well. She's very intelligent, has a PhD in history, and has worked as a professor in her field. Seems to be straightforward about information, and yet, I also like her sense of humor. Just listen, you'll catch it. Well, unless you're a complete rock. Anyway, for more stories, subscribe, like, and share. And don't forget to hit that notification bell for future stories. And as always, I thank you for taking the time to listen. The end.